I think European leaders are taking absolutely the wrong message from what is happening. I mean, they seem to feel that their way back to relevance is to remilitarize, and I think that is a road to catastrophe.
Welcome to everybody. This is a dialogue included in the new project of Lucy and the Words. It's a great pleasure for me to meet and to have this occasion for the conversation with Amitav Ghosh. Welcome to this dialogue.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
For
Telmo.
accepting our invitation. We would like to discuss with you about your non-fiction books because they have been so influential also for the scientific community. You wrote book like The Great Arrangement, that is one of the most quoted books in climate change discussion and debate, even in scientific meeting. Is the same for your non-fiction books. And so what is very unique in your work is a continuous connection between your fiction works that are product of great research, historical research, and non-fiction books. So there is a contamination between these languages that's absolutely wonderful. So my first question is exactly related to The Great Derangement, because I think it's almost 10 years
Yes.
of the publication. So what's your feeling about what you wrote at that time? So because it seems to me that the crisis of imagination that you observe at that time is still there, because emissions, greenhouse emissions are growing, and we have a president of the United States that is related to deniers of climate change. So we still have this problem of imagination, of narrative about this problem.
Well, thank you. Uh, you know, as you say, I wrote the book almost 10 years ago now. And it really has resonated a lot, as you say, with scientists even. Last year, I was invited to deliver the presidential lecture at the annual meeting of the American Geophysical Union, which is the biggest gathering of climate scientists in the world. 25,000 climate scientists gather there. So that was really, it was wonderful to feel that my words are reaching, this vast audience, including scientists and so on. As regards the basic arguments of the book, I think I stand by them, and I think they hold good. The thing I would change in regard to the book is that at that time, I was very much focused on climate change as the major problem. But I think that was too narrow a view. I think, in fact, what we are living in is a very multifaceted planetary crisis. So it's not just climate change, as the famous novelist Margaret Atwood says. It's everything changed. Because
It's a polycrisis
it's a polycrisis.
that we use.
Adam Tooze's term. Yeah, because what we are seeing, biodiversity loss, mass extinctions, the appearance of these dead zones in the seas, it's all amounting to something absolutely cataclysmic. And I think one of the crises that really goes unnoticed is the degradation of the soil. This because it's happened over such a short period, we don't even notice, how much that crisis is accelerating. And it's particularly bad, I think, in India and countries like India. And it's not like it can be quickly fixed, because Sri Lanka, they tried to do agriculture without massive fossil fuel inputs, and there was an absolute agricultural collapse. So we are not
Political, economical, and social consequences.
Oh, exactly.
And conflicts.
Exactly. So, we are now so addicted to fossil fuels at every level, including the production of food. It's very hard to see how we can even hope to go towards a sort of fossil fuel-free future.
So you are invited in great scientific meetings, and you contributed, I think, also to the awareness in science that we needed more skills in communication. Maybe you know that the IPCC, for example, now at the end finally has a commission for communication. So which kind of language we should use? Is it right to use always an apocalyptic language or not? Because it creates resignation and creates a pessimistic feeling in the audience. So, what would you suggest to scientists in order to communicate better this problem to the audience and to politicians as well?
I think scientists were aware of this problem before my book appeared, but my book, it found a ready audience, so to speak, because I think scientists have been aware for a long time about the difficulties of communication. But I think there's a problem there, in the ways in which scientists think about this issue. Because often scientist friends will say to me, oh, you've got to tell our story, you've got to help with our communication. But there are two problems there. One, first of all, is that it's not a communications problem. Mm-hmm. The really sad thing is that everybody knows. Mm-hmm. It's not that people don't know.
Yeah, the data are there.
Everybody knows. So if they're responding to it with denial, it's not as if communication will make them respond differently. They're responding differently because of a political motive. Mm-hmm. It's nothing to do with, it's not a cognitive issue. Mm-hmm. They understand perfectly well what is happening, This is true even of, let's say, Donald Trump. I mean, way back in 2009, he signed a newspaper ad, asking the government to act on climate change. So it's not like he doesn't know. And he also pays insurance for all his seafront properties. So he's well aware of the problem.
Sure.
So that's not the issue. The other thing is, with this whole communication issue, scientists think that they will give writers and artists the message, and then they'll go out and spread the message. But it doesn't work like that. You can't tell a writer what to write. You can't tell a writer, go out there and make propaganda for me. They're just not going to do it. And propaganda of that kind doesn't work. I mean, I'm sure you've seen endlessly when people try to put, climate science in some sort of acceptable, small capsules. Doesn't work at all. No one's interested.
Yeah.
I think the great genius in relation to the communication of climate change is none other than Papa Francesco. I think his Laudato Si was the single most important and most influential document on climate change.
Yeah.
It was so scientifically well informed. He had a whole team of scientists advising him. At the same time, it's so simply written, is written with a genuine effort to reach people. So it's not difficult to know how to communicate these issues. I mean, just read Laudato Si. I mean, it's the best possible manual for communication.
I think that we agree with Naomi Oreskes that say that about climate change, the problem is not just communication, but even not just politics, but our deep social values. So our lifestyle, mainly in United States, and so it's something most profound. And you quoted the Pope Francis Laudato Si. Don't you think that could be interesting, and this could be also a optimistic reality for the future, that we could have a new alliance between, for example, religious thinking like this, religious leaders like Pope Francis, science, environmentalists, anthropologists. So people working in very different fields should be allied for this fight, for fighting together this problem. What do you think? Because at the end of your last book, Smoke and Ashes, the only reason of hope for you is these bottom-up movements, right?
Is I think one of the major problems in this entire field is that this has become too much of an expert discourse. Experts talking to each other. And frankly, when you look at the form of this discourse, it often seems that the experts don't actually want to reach people. So in The Great Derangement, in the last part of The Great Derangement, I do this rhetorical comparison of Laudato Si with, the IPCC reports. And when you look at the IPCC reports, you can see that it's kind of a closed field where experts are, addressing each other.
Just descriptive.
Yeah, I mean, it's very data heavy, just... Whereas Laudato Si again is a document that's trying to open itself up, and especially because Papa Francesco worked with poor people, he understands how to communicate with poor people around the world.
And he comes from the global south.
Exactly, exactly. So I think all of that works in his favor, if you like. Now, yeah, I do think simply because the time horizon is so short, that if there could be some kind of major movement on religious grounds, it would be a great thing. It would be fantastic. But again, let me say that some of the very few reasons for optimism, as I see them, come precisely from this. The first is that the most successful, anti-fossil fuel movements have all been led by indigenous peoples and on grounds of the sacredness of the land,
Yep.
And that's a very striking thing, because even movements like 350.org and so on, it's very hard for them to keep up a continuous battle. Whereas movements led by indigenous peoples have actually built upon earlier struggles around land and so on.
So with practical solutions as well.
With practical solutions, but also, very importantly, placing the sacred at the heart of their struggles. This is a part that is often not foregrounded, unfortunately. But the No Dakota pipeline protests, they were absolutely founded on principles, attached to the sacredness of the water, to the sacredness of the land. And they were accompanied by all kinds of rituals, And those rituals are not extrinsic to the struggle. They're absolutely intrinsic to the struggle.
Sure.
The second reason for optimism, the second front, I would say, is actually the rights of nature movement, which is a very important judicial movement now, and which has had several successes. Again, it's been spearheaded by indigenous peoples, beginning most of all with the indigenous peoples in Ecuador and in New Zealand. That's where they've had the greatest successes. I mean, in Ecuador, actually, the rights of nature, the rights of Pachamama, that is the Mother Earth.
It was included in the Constitution.
Yes, it's in the Constitution. And in New Zealand, I mean, they've actually passed a constitutional amendments recognizing the Wanganui River as a person, and the mountain they've recently recognized also. Why are these things so important? In my book, The Nutmeg's Curse, I've made the argument that really the problem begins with, the problem is, in a sense, ontological. It's how we conceive of the earth, how we imagine, all the contents of the earth, as it were. And since the 17th century, since the birth of some certain kind of scientific worldview, we've begun to look at the earth as a sort of mechanical, as a clock. It's a completely mechanical worldview where only humans have reason and agency and being, and everything else is just a robot or it's a machine or something.
Under our control.
And they're under
Eventually,
our control.
yeah.
So the moment you accept that a mountain can have personhood, what you are actually acknowledging is that there are other universes alongside this universe that we inhabit. There are other universes in which mountains are people, in which rivers are beings, and they're not just beings, they're procreative beings. Because that's what the New Zealand Constitution has actually acknowledged, that the Wanganui people are the descendant of the Wanganui River. Now, this is actually a major ontological shift.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. I've been recently in New Zealand, and it's great to see, for example, in the great parks in New Zealand, where you see the Maori people managing, dealing with the public, and you can have this visit where the Maori guides mix together scientific information about nature and the fact that this mountain is a god, and this mountain is again this other mountain, the volcanoes. So that's interesting. The mixing of these two languages. That's interesting. But another case that I would like a comment from you is the the fact, maybe you know that recently scientists discussed about the possibility to introduce the Anthropocene term in the official language, and they refuted it for technical reasons, because we don't know exactly when Anthropocene started in the past. But mainly, for me, Anthropocene could have another problem, that it seems, if you use Anthropocene, it seems that the anthropos, so the whole human species, has the same responsibility, and this is not true. So what do you think about this debate about the use of terms like Anthropocene or Capitalocene or other these kinds of terms that we need in the public debate? I know.
When the Anthropocene term was introduced, who was it? Crutzen who
Paul
introduced it?
Crutzen, yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
So
25 years
95
ago.
or something,
Yeah, exactly.
When he introduced it, it had a shock value. It suddenly shocked people to imagine that, humans have become a geological force. So it had a rhetorical use, a rhetorical purpose, and it served that rhetorical purpose. Whether we should actually treat the Anthropocene as a major sort of cognitive category or epistemological category, there I think, I'm completely agnostic. I think, there are these scientists making up words like Capitalocene and Cthulhucene and Plantationocene and hundreds of other. That's because, if you ask me, it's because academics have too much time on their hands. So they like
to invent new words.
Yes. They love to invent new words. So, it just seems like a game. We all understand perfectly well what is meant by Anthropocene and by the very limited purpose that it has, which is a rhetorical purpose. The other point you're making is, yes, of course. It homogenizes all of humanity. Whereas we know perfectly well that it wasn't all of humanity. It was actually a very small minority that have given us this huge problem.
The Western minority.
Yeah.
Two quick questions about fate now, because one fate is, in your last book, you discussed a lot about this fate in the free exchange. So the free market has something like a religious fate. And you explain in the book, but also in the nutmeg course and so on, that free market is an illusion, is not a reality. So why free market is just fate and not reality in the past and even today?
But simply because there's never been a free market. This is an idea that comes into being in the late 18th century, and as I've described in this book, all the major opium traders, some of them were actually students of Adam Smith. Many of them were Scottish. They were products of the Scottish Enlightenment. And they used a free market ideology to justify the opium trade. And we know now that, in fact, there's nothing free about the opium trade. It's being produced under coerced labor. And we also know that with addictive substances, supply doesn't follow demand. It's the other way around. Supply creates demand, and they know that perfectly well. And for example, the family that owned the major OxyContin producing company, Richard Sackler, actually said, we don't chase markets, we create markets. So, the people who create these things are perfectly well aware that there is no such thing as a free market. The free market is a rhetorical device which countries, when they're on the rise, they promote free trade because it benefits them, and then when it stops benefiting them, they do away with it, just like the United States is doing now. For the last 30 years, it was all free trade, free trade, free trade, and now suddenly you have a U-turn because suddenly the US is discovering that in even a half free market, they actually can't compete. They can't compete with China. They can't compete with India and with so many other countries. So when they discover that, they suddenly wake up with a shock, and Germany with its automobiles, suddenly this whole country built upon this industry.
Yeah, Amitav, there is another faith about which I'm quite skeptical today. That is the faith that we call in technical terms as technological solutionism. So the fact that, okay, don't worry, you can continue your business as usual because we will find a great miraculous technological solution and we will solve all the environmental crisis. I found it very dangerous. What do you think about this? This trend?
I completely agree with you. I think this is magical thinking. I mean, that's the actually weird part about it. All these sort of very materialist scientists and engineers, in the end, it seems that they believe in magic much more than, religious people or whatever. Because for years now, they've been telling us that there'll be these magical solutions, carbon capture at scale, or,
geoengineering and stuff like
geoengineering and stuff like that. And I do think it's actually really very dangerous because many of the geoengineering solutions that they're proposing, it's perfectly possible that they'll have disastrous impacts on the global south. They're considering spraying aerosols into the atmosphere or chemicals into the atmosphere. And we just don't know how these will interact with, atmospheric systems like the monsoons. Because, look, I mean, it's like you're using the disease and pretending it's the cure. Because if you look around us at all the mechanisms that have created climate change, all of them are the unintended consequences of some technologies, I mean, after all, when the internal combustion engine was first introduced, everybody thought, oh, wow, this is a miracle. It's it's the best thing that's ever happened. And now we see what a disaster it's turned out to be. So, yes, I am completely on the same page as you. I think these are, in the first place, they're just selling us a bag of goods, a bill of goods, because this is not, they haven't found those solutions. And those solutions probably aren't going to come. Secondly, even, many of those things that are sold to us as solutions, for example, alternative energy sources of various kinds. I'm all for alternative energy, but it's not as those don't have environmental impacts. You need
the landscape and so
the landscape, also rare earths to create solar energy. For wind energy, again, you have to use a lot of carbon-intensive materials to build the wind towers and so on. So these will not also provide magical solutions,
It's also a trade-off that we have to consider
case
by case. But now another question on the other side. So we have also to accept and to admit that the so-called great acceleration, mainly after the Second World War, produced a great wellness for a part of the humanity and advancements, for example, in medicine or in health and so on. So what's your feeling about the idea of progress in this very basic sense that we had goods from the technologies and from science? Are you completely negative or do you accept the idea that we had anyway goods from the progress that we had in the 3 last generations?
I've just been sent a manuscript, which I'm reading with great interest. It's called Progress, the Worst Idea in Human Civilization, or something like this. Progress is basically an idea that in the 18th century people seize upon and, keep pushing. And basically it's the idea that was used also to justify slavery, indentured labor, the seizure of the commons and so on. Only by displacing people, making some people suffer, will humanity progress. But it's never humanity that progresses. It's always a very small section of humanity that actually progresses. Now, if you look back on human history, I mean, the temptation is, because we are bombarded with all these data points all the time, we are sort of put in this position of having to say, oh, well, life before the 18th century or whatever must have been terrible. People were desperately sad. They suffered so much. This is the worst kind of presentism. I think in many ways, actually, you can see that so many forms of life were actually better, until they were touched by progress. Famously, as Benjamin Franklin pointed out, in the 18th and 19th century in America, Whenever, there were lots of white people running away to live with Native Americans. There was the single Native American who wanted to run away and live with white people. So, it's a strange dynamic that you see there.
Opium is another case in which we had a whole country like China so destroyed year by year after due to a plant. It's interesting in your story about the opium, the fact that you describe opium as a main actor, so as an actor with power, with intelligence. So it's just for you a rhetoric, narrative instrument tool, or do you feel that this anthropomorphic or animistic approach to plants could help us to explain what happened in this story?
I think anthropocentrism was another really terrible idea that was used to shut down many kinds of discussion and many kinds of debates. I mean, we know now that so many kinds of creatures do communicate, and communicate in ways that it's perfectly understandable to human beings. I mean, they gave African gray parrots cell phones, and they found that they were calling each other regularly to stay in touch. We know the trees in a forest communicate. What they communicate, we don't know. But why should it be so difficult, after all, to accept that we all co-evolved? Obviously, some elements of every kind of being in creation, whether it be botanical or animal or whatever, that we ourselves incorporate some elements of those responses. I mean, we know animals of so many kinds can feel grief, that many animals go mad. That's a very common phenomenon, in fact.
We recently discovered that whales have a language, a structured language with syntactical patterns.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. We know that they actively make history in the sense that they respond. In the 19th century, they responded to whaling fleets by withdrawing deeper and deeper into the Arctic ice. So, yes, I think it's certainly very possible that there are all kinds of continuities, between plants. I don't know if you've ever heard of an Indian physicist called Jagadish Chandra Bose. No?
No?
I'm sure you'll find his work very interesting, because he was working in the 1880s, 1890s, and he was very mechanically skilled. And he invented this machine called the crescograph. Actually, he invented a lot of things. He invented, some certain devices which actually helped Marconi with his radio. But he also invented this. He created this instrument called the crescograph, which is a very delicate instrument, and it can measure responses in plants and also in metals. And there was a time when he was very, very, very popular. He would put on these demonstrations in Europe, But then, the sort of scientific establishment, this was the idea that plants respond to stimuli, was very shocking for mainstream scientists, European scientists. So they eventually shut him down, as it were. Though he continued to have a great practice in India. So he demonstrated this, that, plants of many kinds, now, of course, everybody knows this and recognizes this. But he
anticipated
a long
line
time
of research.
Exactly, yes.
And it's always striking for me that we in the Western societies, we don't know quite nothing about scientists from the global South. In the global South, they know quite everything about us.
Yes.
So there is an asymmetry, completely asymmetry between us. So just a final general question, because we discuss a lot about Western societies and the global South. But it seems to me that especially now, with Trump in the United States and Europe, don't you think that there are many Western societies, so many way to be in the West or not? So do you accept that there is a multiplicity of interpretation of to be Western or not?
I think there were always many Wests. In fact, they asked Mahatma Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? And he said, I think it would be a good idea. But so there have always been many different kinds of Wests, But the really weird thing is that today, the people who are most sold on some of the worst Western ideas are, in fact, the elites of the global South. I mean, that's where you see the maximum extractivism, basically war upon nature. I mean, it's like dig up coal like there's no tomorrow. I mean, that's basically what's happening in India.
Because they studied in the universities in the United States
I mean, they've absorbed those. Over time, So, 100 years ago, Mahatma Gandhi would talk about not despoiling the land and so on. But now it's just full-on extractivism.
So just finally, what do you expect in this? What's your feeling living in New York now after 2 months of Donald Trump at the presidency? And what do you think about this new, very worrying fight between to be Western, like in Europe, like here in the whole Europe, and to be Western in the United States? As an Indian writer and thinker in New York now.
It's a very strange and interesting time to be living in, and I must say I never foresaw that what is happening today would happen in my lifetime, because what we are seeing is a epochal geopolitical shift. Europe, which for five centuries was central to global geopolitics, today can be seen as completely marginalized. That is really an epochal shift. And for people, for the leadership of Europe, I mean, it's you can see, I mean, they're virtually going mad. They don't know how to adapt to this, to their marginalization. And you can see why it's difficult for them. It's difficult after 5 centuries of domination to suddenly find yourself leading the way to marginalization, And so, yes, I mean, there are two very different kinds of West emerging. One which is, I'm sorry to say, really, in a geopolitical sense, increasingly less relevant. I mean, the fact that these negotiations now take place in Riyadh rather than in some Western capital, I mean, that in itself is a
symbolic.
Is a very symbolic
meaning.
thing. It's a very, very symbolic, but it's a very powerful symbol for 2 reasons. One is that it symbolizes the importance of fossil fuels.
Sure.
In the first place. The second is that it symbolizes the geopolitical marginalization of Europe. But, there again, you have to say that this is something that Europeans of your generation have brought upon yourselves.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't help wondering, those German engineers, what were they thinking of?
Yeah, exactly. We can just hope that we will be able to face with the challenge in a positive way, so to transform this traumatic situation in something new. Who knows?
I think European leaders are taking absolutely the wrong message from what is happening. I mean, they seem to feel that their way back to relevance is to remilitarize.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a road to catastrophe, I mean, my hope for Europe would really be that no matter what happens geopolitically, Europe will continue to be among the world's leaders in art, in culture, in cuisine, in music, in sport, in so many fields. Why is that not enough?
Sure, I totally agree. This is a great conclusion. So thank you so much, Amitav. It was great to meet you. And see you soon to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lucy.